Imagine turning passion into powerful leadership on and off the field. At FSU, you can earn a 100% online master's or graduate certificate in athletic coaching. Designed by coaches, for coaches, no matter your experience or sport.
FSU Center for Athletic Coaching, educating today's coaches to lead tomorrow's athletes.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Coach Talk. My name is Tim Baghurst, and today's guest is Dennis Scanlon. Dennis is a distinguished professor of health policy and administration. He's also the faculty athletics representative for Penn State University. Dennis, thanks for joining me. We met at a youth sport conference, had a great conversation, and my thought was, you know what? Why am I just listening to you? I think a lot of people could benefit from what you have to say. So before we get into it, just share a little bit of your background and kind of what you do at Penn State.
Sure. Well, thanks, Tim. And it was great to meet you in Boston as well. Maybe we'll get into sort of talking about what the nature of that meeting is relative to college athletics. But I've been at Penn State actually just completing my 29th year. Hard to believe. I'll be starting year 30. So I've been there for quite some time. I'm a health economist and I do health policy research. My work really focuses on pricing and market consolidation, and there's a lot of that going on in healthcare, and really sort of solutions to fix what I think are many things that are broken in healthcare. We haven't fixed them yet. Ironically, about 9 years or so ago, I got into this role of faculty athletics rep, and happy to talk a little bit more about the details of that. But, a lot of what's going on in college athletics right now is focused on, quite frankly, very similar things: antitrust law and labor law, and what that means for compensation of student athletes at the college level, what that might mean about potential employment, and what that means in terms of, market consolidation and market power. And many people are looking to public policy, specifically Congress, to solve those issues. So there's a remarkable similarity between what I do on a day-to-day basis in teaching and research on the healthcare side, and then when I put this hat on and thinking about the broader landscape of collegiate athletics in particular. But I teach, I do research, mentor students, a lot of the same things that many faculty do. I'm sure if you want to, I can get into the journey of sort of why college athletics and athletics generally. I was a former student athlete in college, had always played various sports throughout my life, have been a parent of 4 student athletes, including 2 Division I student athletes, and have really, athletics has always been a part of who I am.
I'm really curious your take right now on college athletics as a whole. My students right now in class, we're looking at sociology of sports, and when I ask them to discuss a topic of interest to them, almost, I would say, half of them talk about, I want to talk about transfer portal, I want to talk about NIL, I want to talk about athletes being paid or not being paid, the survival of small sports, Olympic sports, for example, that may not generate revenue, and now athletic directors are looking at them going, well, you're an expense, I need that money for football or baseball or basketball. What's your perspective from maybe a top-down approach of where we are and where we may be going?
Yeah. Oh, so many things to talk about and so many directions you can go with that. So, maybe a few high level and we can dive into the details. I'm very concerned and have been very concerned because at the end of the day, I think for those of us, and I think hopefully most everybody that likes sports generally believes that there's a lot of value. There's value in participation. It builds a lot of personal skills and resiliency, the ability to work and interact with others, team-based skills, and really helps individuals develop themselves as individual leaders, as employees, as family members and parents, and so forth and so on. So a tremendous value through the learning opportunities and participation opportunities that people have in sport at every level, from youth all the way up to college. And, if you can make a career at the pro level. I'm very concerned that what's going on we may lose some of that because of the commercialization. Don't get me wrong, we're where we are in college athletics at the Division I level right now because it is a commercial enterprise. And I understand, and again, we can get into the details, that the legal aspect of this has spoken and said that it is a commercial aspect, and therefore student athletes should be entitled to some compensation. The courts have been pretty clear about that. So then the question is, well, how do we enforce rules, and how do we bring some sanity to this? And also importantly, few people talk about competitive equity, right? Say what you want about professional sports leagues, but they're designed to produce some level of competitive equity, so the games are interesting and people are willing to pay. I think it was a major D1 athletic director within the past week or two that said, the difference between college athletics and the pro ranks is that the pro teams realize that they're in this together. They're all in the same business, and they succeed or fail based on the product they put on the floor. And you have to have some reasonable competitive equity to keep it interesting. Last night, if you watch that Knicks and Spurs game, that was a great game that was decided by 1 point, right? There's competitive equity there, and it makes it compelling. So the way this is playing out in college athletics really concerns me. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. And it concerns me that we're going to lose competitive equity. We're going to lose participation opportunities. We're going to lose interest at the youth level. Again, I'm okay with the fact that parts of college athletics is a commercial business, and that compensation in some form can happen for student athletes. But I think we really need to figure out how to do this well and do this right. We need rules that can be enforced, and right now that's really the problem. So again, very high level answer. We can any of that if you.
It does seem to be a bit of a wild, wild west right now, where every college is looking at how do we navigate this, but how do we exploit this too? How do we get the advantage over our opponents? And one of the things I've seen over the last couple weeks, and I say this cautiously because I'm not an expert in this area, but we've seen almost corporations coming in and taking over the business side of athletics and saying, hey, we're going to run this as a business rather than as an athletics department. Are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, there's certainly reported news to that effect. Institutions outsourcing, if not all, significant portions of their athletics department. That gets into a whole host of ideological issues as well as operational issues, right? If you're a public institution, are you allowed to outsource part of your operations, right? When some portion of your revenue, either historically or even currently, comes from, let's say, state legislature, right? So, so what's feasible? For people talk about private equity. Well, can you actually sell off equity in your institution, your academic institution? Certainly, public institutions can't do that. Private institutions maybe, but that's not their history. And so there's talk about creating these, sort of third party entities that are subsidiaries of the university for purposes of commercialization. So, yeah, there's just a lot of important issues, and I'll go back to sort of the point of, one of the things about professional sports, I would say, which is a benefit, is they coexist and they have rules that are enforced, sometimes because of players associations that they collectively bargain with, right? Some people are saying that some of the court decisions that have been made locally, like the most recent one in Texas, that would never go to court in a professional rank because the players association would self-police, right? It would set up rules that say, if you bet and gamble on your team, you're not going to get to play. And the Players Association is enforcing that. We don't have such a thing because we don't have employment. We don't have collective bargaining in college athletics. So I think there's lots of things being looked at right now. And, the other thing, quite frankly, is it seems to me that at that rank, another benefit is because we have a draft and, that rotates each year in terms of who gets to select players. We have some level of access to the best players through something like a draft. When you have, employment terms through collective bargaining that have salary caps and things of that nature that are enforceable. You have team rosters that have salaries that are within spitting distance of each other. I'm not an expert on these. Some sports like Major League Baseball may have the Yankees versus the Pirates or whatever the case may be, but it's set up to have some degree of competitive equity. Right now in Division I college athletics, that's not the case. And so you have the haves and the have-nots, and you have those with, stronger brand recognition. And the question is, how does everybody kind of coexist, and what that future is going to look like? I'd be remiss also to say that I think it's important that we don't look at college athletics as just from the Division I lens. There are many Division III schools with phenomenal student athletes that, are this close to having been Division I athletes, a couple inches too small, maybe a little, less fast or whatever the case may be. But to play college athletics at Division I, Division II, Division III at any level, you have to be a very good student athlete. And I think a lot of the problems that we're seeing right now are concentrated in the Division I level primarily. But because the NCAA historically has been an institution with all three divisions that make rules, it's a little bit of a unwieldy political body on the one hand, but in the financials will be impacted at all levels based on what we decide. But I don't think that some of the problems that are existing at the Division I level necessarily exist at levels like Division III, where there is no compensation, there is no scholarship. And so, in many ways, some people believe that's one of the purest forms of college sport.
A very valid point. Now, you are faculty athletics representative at Penn State, and I want to get into a little bit more about your roles and responsibilities because it's a unique position. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you, in relation to this, do you see this becoming more of a tiered Division I? And I ask this because I'm at Florida State, and I can't speak for Florida State Seminole program, but I know our endowment is not what it is compared to some other schools, which are much larger. And as a consequence, we may see players who maybe have a great season get poached by a team that has more income and is willing to throw more money at athletes and say, hey, great season. Now it's time to come play for one of the big teams and have a real chance at a national championship. And of course, as somebody who's at FSU, I look at that and go, no, that's not fair. You can't do that. We developed this player, and now essentially they're being farmed out to another team for more money. Are you seeing some of that in your role where you're hearing this kind of discussion? And I say this because this happened, it appears to have happened very recently here at FSU, where one of the best players on a team unexpectedly entered the transfer portal. And a lot of people suggested, well, it's just because there's going to be a much higher paycheck somewhere else.
Yeah. Well, not only am I hearing about it, I've seen it as well firsthand, and it's a fact. It's a reality. My son played Division I college basketball at St. Francis University, one of the smallest Division Is. He had multiple teammates who had all conference seasons and went up to the Atlantic 10. They went up to other conferences from the Northeast Conference where St. Francis played, simply because as first-year students, they had great all-conference seasons. And I don't know the deals of their compensation from an NIL perspective, but I do know that some of those, were able to make that jump because they were able to take advantage of that. So it is happening, no doubt. And it's happening at places like Florida State and Penn State and, in the ACC and the Big 12. I mean, this player movement and player rotation is in part driven by playing time, yes, but it's also based on, dollar amounts. And I don't think there's any question about that. What's frustrating about that are I think two things. Again, that's the market that we're in, and the courts and the law have spoken to suggest that that's allowed. So I think it's going to be hard to kind of go back on that. But, people are looking at, should there be some rules? And then who sets the rules, and are those rules enforceable? And that's really the challenge. The NCAA hasn't been too successful And now even conferences, and within conferences, we don't see a lot of agreement on sort of these rules. This is with the College Sports Commission and their ability to do their job and everything right now. But what I would say is, from a bigger picture perspective, including those, who listen to your podcast that are interested in coaching, I think opportunities for the traditional pathway to college athletics for high school students are changing. Because now you can go out and get a transfer and add to your roster somebody who is older, bigger, stronger, and has demonstrated experience, even again at a smaller Division I conference. But you get to see those smaller D1s play the big, the bigger schools in the non-conference segment of their basketball season, let's say. So you can kind of scout them. So as a coach, why would you recruit a high school kid necessarily who you're going to have to develop, knowing that potentially when you develop them and they have a good year, they're out the door, right? So I think it changes the dynamics of relationships. It changes the way you recruit. It changes the thought process on developing student athletes. And I think it's changing the pathway to college athletics, for high school students and then the academic experience of college students as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I also think it's going to even exacerbate the farming system, because there will be programs that just cannot essentially afford to pull that great player out of the transfer portal. So they're required to go to the high school and develop those players. And then 1 year, 2 years down the road, just accept that those players are moving on to a more lucrative contract.
Yep.
The danger I see in all of this right now is there seems to be no limit or cap to what can be spent for a specific player. And we see that in professional sports. There are limits in general for most sports. A team cannot spend more than this on players, etc. But in college, it seems that whoever has the most resources can get or pay the most for these athletes. However, this seems to be, or feels as if it's not sustainable, because this is not reoccurring funding. This is maybe a booster or a donor is putting forward X amount of money, or a company to get this player in who's there, takes the money, leaves. Now you have to start it all over. So are we going to reach a point where this bubble is burst, where we just can't keep spending more?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. If I had to sort of predict, I think, there's got to be a limit at some point, but it's anybody's guess, and I think time will tell. It really kind of comes down. So a couple of things here. It comes down to those who are funding the system. What return or value are they getting for their money, right? And if you're a corporation and you're, trying to do an endorsement and use that endorsement, Caitlin Clark with State Farm, right? Presumably
Right.
the leadership, the management of that organization is not so interested in just funneling money to an athlete. They're interested in the commercial benefit, of the endorsement for their business, right? And so they have to see a return on investment. If you're a super fan that has an unlimited pocketbook and you want to see your team win, your definition of an ROI may be much different. It may be, I want to win a national championship. And if anything else, you might be willing to continue to spend, but you might want to see a new coach if they haven't been able to reach that plateau that you're looking for, within a few years. So I think we're going to have to, sort of wait and see. My guess is there's a lot of boosters, donors, supporters who are providing some resources right now that at some point might say, I don't want to keep doing this. That's just a hypothesis. I've heard some people say, and I know I feel this way sometimes as well, I'd like to see a 4-year student athlete or a 5-year student athlete. I'd like to see that progression. I'd like to watch and see somebody get a minute or two in a game and show, maybe make a mistake and show some signs of brilliance. And then 2-3 years later, sort of see, wow, how they've developed. To me, that interests me as a fan. If fans aren't seeing that, are they going to want to continue to put money into the system? I don't know. So I think it's anyone's guess. I also think that, there are rules. I mean, so with the House settlement, which was accomplished like not even a year ago. It was July 1st, I think, when that went into effect in 2025. We're less than a year of implementation in the House settlement, which set a revenue share cap of about $20.5 million. And that was supposed to be an upper bound on how much revenue would be shared by the universities or the colleges with their student athletes. You didn't have to spend that much, but you couldn't spend more. There was always this component of the NIL component, though. And NIL was not revenue share. It was, what you would pay somebody for the market value of their name, their image, and likeness. Again, going back to Caitlin Clark, right? There's some value there in endorsement that can lead to commercial benefit for a company like, say, a State Farm. The problem is that, NIL is being used. Many people believe, you can't enforce this revenue share cap because of the NIL component, and many people believe that the NIL is basically a way to circumvent the revenue cap. And so, until we can figure out how to address that, if you're going to have both and you're going to allow both, we're going to be in this very tight space. In theory, the College Sports Commission, which was created as part of the House settlement, was supposed to review these NIL deals. Every student athlete that had one over $600 was supposed to report it. And the College Sports Commission was supposed to review it and say, is it within the ballpark of fair market value? Or is it an end around, by a so-called associated entity, a booster or a company who really has no interest in bringing value to their own business? They have interest in seeing that student athlete go to that institution. So it's a recruitment inducement, which was not supposed to be allowed. The problem is we just aren't really able to enforce that right now. And so until we can kind of get to a point where that's the case, we're really in a difficult spot.
If you could have carte blanche, you could fix something within this model, because I think we can both agree that it's not working maybe the way that it should work. What would you fix in order to make this better?
Yeah, and again, I go back to the fixing part being, when we're talking about the money and we're talking about a lot of these issues, we're really talking about Division I, and we're talking about even subcategories of Division I, because there are some smaller Division I conferences in many sports where student athletes might be getting some portion of athletic aid, but they're not really getting anything extra in terms of revenue share or even NIL or anything, beyond maybe doing a camp in their community where they're now allowed to earn a little bit of money and revenue. And I think that's fine. Go back home and put on a camp for youth kids, and you're a role model for them, and put a few bucks in your pocket, not a problem with that. So it's this smaller, but still fairly large subset. What would I fix? Again, recognizing that the law and the commercialization at that level is pretty much spoken and said, gone are the days when you have to be a so-called amateur and you can't receive anything. So I'm basically saying we're in that space, right? So that's a condition. I'd like to see, a couple things. I mean, I think that we got in part to this because of our expenditure issues, including coaching salaries in some cases, right? The big money has often gone to big resources and, some of the well-publicized and reported big contracts. And, I think some of the players said, hey, where's our piece of the pie, right? So I think, I guess I'd like to see it all be guided and driven by what is the ultimate purpose and mission of an academic institution. Let's start there. And I hear very little conversation in any of this nationally to say, this is an enterprise that's a subset of a much larger enterprise, which is higher education, designed to educate all kinds of students, student athletes included. And the athletic component is one piece, an important piece, the front porch, as people often say, and important for many alumni and donors and boosters. But it all should fit within the mission of what's the purpose of higher ed. If you start to go down that path, there are a couple principles that I personally think are valuable. One is this enterprise and the commercialization of this enterprise has not just sprung up in the last 5 years. This has been decades in the making by virtue of associating college athletics with institutions and creating fandom and creating the commercialization operation. And so the value of the brand today is contingent on decades of fan support, of student support, of state support for public institutions, of tuition payers, everybody that's been affiliated with the institution, because to create the commercialization, you need passionate fans. Well, those passionate fans start by being students who are tuition paying. They start with some states having supported higher ed to support the construction of facilities, to subsidize the education that we're providing to the students. So, this market value was built on the backs of decades of many people. And what that says to me is that, well, yes, we can share some of the revenue. Some of the margin, if you will, it should go back to the purpose of the institution, right? And some of that is support broad-based sport offerings, non-revenue sports, right? Some of the value of the brand, I would like to see maintain Olympic and non-revenue sports, maintain the progress we've made on Title IX, for male and female student athletes and those kinds of things. But I think if you go back to what's the purpose of higher ed, so I'll use, my institution as an example. At Penn State, we have somewhere on the order of, 72 to 80,000 students across all our campuses and across all of our instructional platforms. And, we have 850 Division I student athletes, right? If you look at the athletics budget as a percentage of the total university budget, I think it's, maybe around 3%. But it's high profile, obviously, at a Florida State and a Penn State. But if you put it into that perspective, I think it gets you to a point of this should fit with the rest of the institution. And I think we lose sight of that. And I don't hear much of that discussed. So, I would start there. And quite frankly, I think over many decades, maybe some of the leaders in higher ed, should have been asking that question all along and did not.
Yeah, great points. Based on my experience, especially at Division I, and I've worked at Division II, which has been quite different, is how disconnected athletics can be from the academic world of the institution, where it is almost two different companies working under the same name, rather than this symbiotic relationship where faculty work with athletics work with faculty. We all support the student athlete. Sometimes I think there's a danger of separating the two, and I think that's happening even more, especially with increased discussion about outsourcing a lot of the business side of athletics. I think it's just going to continue. I want to change.
If I could chime in just on that point, I think you're absolutely right. And given that your podcast is about coaching, I've had conversations with some of the coaches I got to know early on in my role who, now have retired or have moved on. And you probably are aware of this as well. In the collegiate coaching profession, I think historically at almost any level, oftentimes coaches were also teachers.
Yep.
They wore multiple hats, so they coached a team and they taught a phys ed or a recreation course or a coaching course for that matter. Right. And, I've had a number of I'll call the old guard, if you will, who have said to me, Dennis, quite frankly, I think the problem today is that, we have professional coaches. They haven't really spent time in the classroom with students. And therefore they do view campus as like being separate from them. Right. And that changes the conversation. So, it's quite frankly, probably not so different than specialization in other industries as well. We've gotten to the point where everybody's so hyper-focused on a particular component that even within a, for-profit or not-for-profit organization, sometimes one person's function, they're so driven by that function that they sort of lose sight of what the overall vision or mission of the institution is. You can have that happen. And I do think that is, part of what's happened in college athletics as well.
And I'll continue and say the same thing is happening in many high school environments where if the state does not require the coach to be a teacher or work in the school, we're seeing a lot of external individuals being hired to coach but have no ties to the school and therefore are not in the classrooms speaking with counselors, etc., don't know the school culture. They just come in, coach their sport, and leave. So I think we're seeing that trickle down as well into high school. But talk a little bit, if you would, about faculty athletics representative. What is that? What do you do? What are some of the roles and responsibilities and maybe challenges associated with a role like that?
Yeah. So the NCAA requires that its member organizations at all levels, Division I, Division II, Division III, have a faculty athletics rep, FAR as we call it. And, when you actually look to find a position description from the NCAA of the FAR, there are a couple of different sources out there, but, I'd like to see it a little bit more codified perhaps. But a few things that are required. It is supposed to be a full-time faculty member, oftentimes a faculty member with kind of permanent standing. That might be tenure or at least a, sort of a more permanent role, who reports directly to the institution's president or chancellor, and not to the athletics department, but has to work with everybody in college athletics. And that means a close relationship with the AD staff, as well as the faculty and others. And, I think philosophically, the purpose of this is to say that first and foremost, NCAA member institutions are academic institutions. We tie the athletic experience to the broader goal of obtaining a college degree. And there's eligibility and other rules related to making sure that the academic integrity component of that is maintained. And so we want to make sure that there's an individual who has oversight of that, eyes and ears for the president or the chancellor, if you will, who obviously have many different things that they need to focus on to make sure that that purpose and that vision and that mission is not lost. And I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think the role varies at Division I, Division II, Division III levels. I've talked to some Division III FARs, and they do great work. I think in their case, they may be less concerned about some of these legal or financial issues that we've discussed that, I'm concerned about at the Division I level, and may have a little bit more time to focus on, the holistic experience and to do some mentorship and think about, career opportunities. I'd say within Division I, even within a conference like the Big Ten, I know all of my colleagues, and I think there's variation across our institutions in terms of what we all do. Fundamentally, it goes back to that role that I just described. But I think it, really on a campus, it relates a little bit to the history and the culture of the campus and how they've used this role. It relates to, who the president or chancellor is in their experience in working with an FAR. Fortunately, I have a president, I think, who values the position and I think also understands my professional experience in economics and public policy and antitrust and, sort of awareness of that I can bring to the table in these times. I think you have to have the respect or earn the respect of the athletic director. And again, that goes both ways. An athletic director who values education and the educational experience, but also sees an FAR who values competition, wants to win, but also sort of, wants to do it in the right way and maintain the integrity. So, in terms of day-to-day operations and duties, some of the core features that the FAR oversees is establishment of eligibility of student athletes, making sure that progress towards degree, meeting NCAA requirements towards progress towards degree are met. You can't just come in and take a bunch of classes. You've got to be on a pathway to get a degree, and you've got to proceed, 40% of that degree to 60 to 80%, ultimately working to 100% of your chosen majors courses. And so that's a big issue for transfers, right? If you come in from one institution to another and you haven't really had a kind of curriculum that fits a major, you might find that it's not going to work at the new institution because you're never going to meet NCAA eligibility issues. Beyond that, missed class time in thinking about, time away from campus, thinking about the health and welfare of student athletes, that's where there's a lot of variation and deviation across different institutions in terms of how much into which weeds, we all get into. I'd say in the Big Ten, we have a good network of amongst ourselves. And so we keep ourselves apprised, and we share lessons amongst each other. We also have meetings multiple times a year where we're in the same room with athletic directors and with the conference staff and with the senior woman administrator at our institutions. So, we get to talk amongst ourselves, and we're not just solely on our own.
Now, you and I met at essentially a youth sport conference. And for those who aren't familiar, youth sports has something in the region of $40 billion a year floating around in the US, which is a staggering number when you think about it. And I've noticed, Dennis, that the cost of participating in youth sports just seems to go up and up and up, to the point where I saw recently, even in Florida, they're now talking about charging parents of children who do not attend that specific school, i.e., maybe they're homeschooled, they do online school, something like that. They're going to levy essentially a fee on them to participate in interscholastic sports. And I look at all this and go, wow, there's a lot of money floating around. There's a lot of people invested in this, in youth sports in general, whether it be as a coach, as a parent, as an owner of a club. You're a public policy person. Where are we in the US? Because to me, it just seems like this big, gargantuan, almost monster that just can't be controlled anymore. And we have all sorts of sports organizations all out doing their own thing, promoting their own way, trying to find the best way to do things. There seems to be no guidance, guidelines, even dare I say, national standards. Where are we? Because going to that summit was just very eye-opening to me, to just see how diverse everything is and how everybody is doing so many things differently.
Yeah. No, I feel the same way, and I will say this is an area that I'm trying to learn and understand a little bit more about myself. But I'm now, in retrospect, not surprised, having been, a youth athlete, a former collegiate athlete, and now, sort of a parent of youth athletes, college athletes, and now in this role that I'm at, and I'm starting to reflect more on this bigger picture. The first thing I would say is, I'm not surprised, and this is where there's a lot of similarities to U.S. healthcare, right? There are some people who believe that, or want to argue, get the government out of my healthcare. Well, newsflash, the U.S. government and the state governments have been involved in American healthcare for 4 to 5 decades at a minimum. We have something called the Medicare program. We have Medicaid programs, and if you look at the percentage of funding for healthcare services in this country, it's, if not beyond 50%, it's at least that. So this notion that, government's not involved in healthcare. But having said that, there's a very much capitalistic, pluralistic commercial component. So the challenge with healthcare is we've got this capitalistic enterprise on the one hand, companies that are for-profit, Wall Street traded, including insurance and device and drug companies, but they coexist with some degree of government payment, government regulation, and it creates a little bit of a messy environment because everybody's got their self-interest. And as I'm learning more and contemplating more about youth sports and the whole industry, right, I think it's very similar, right? I mean, there's a demand, or demand can be created to camps, clinics, equipment, apparel, private lessons, coaching, club teams, right? And we live in a capitalistic society where if you can conceive of a business, you can make a profit. And if you have a business that's charged with making a profit, you're going to try to get as many customers as you can. And I think that as I've learned more, and that conference in Boston was very valuable, you see that, that this has happened. I kind of had a yeah, a moment, because I saw this with my own kids, sort of, as they proceeded. My oldest is 28, my youngest is 22, so this was over the past, 10, 15 or so years where they were coming up from the youth level. And as a parent, I saw this. When I was a high school student or a youth sports student, I remember in Pittsburgh playing ice hockey. This was right around when Mario Lemieux kind of came to Pittsburgh and hockey took off. But a friend of mine in high school was asking some of us to join a club team that was going to travel to Cleveland and Detroit and places like that. And he did it. And my parents said, absolutely not. We're not going that path. Today, you probably don't play college hockey if you not only don't do that, but you don't go to juniors, right? And so for many sports, that's your pathway to get at least to the Division I level. And I think there was a speaker at that meeting in Boston that gave some evidence about how the commercialization of youth sports at all levels, including up to and beyond high school, has gotten to the point where that speaker argued it's approaching antitrust violation. It's actually becoming consolidated to the point where it's not just people are making money, but people, enterprises are gobbling up other enterprises to control the marketplace within a sport or within a category, and they kind of own the business. So it really is eye-opening. And the reason I went to that, former FAR colleague, a friend of mine, Pete Miller from the University of Wisconsin, he does some research that looks at some of these issues that I think you look at. What's happening at the high school level, at the youth sport level? What does this mean for the ability for students to participate at any level? To rec leagues, and not to get locked out, to continue to participate over time. And there are many people that value that, and looking at what we're doing, or with this industry, if you will, is doing to those opportunities. So I think it's an important topic. It's one that I'm interested in learning a little bit more about. But I can say that as I look back in retrospect now with my 4 kids, it's much different. I remember when I graduated from college, I played ice hockey at Villanova University. I went to do a master's degree, and I went back and I was a volunteer high school coach, and I did some camps, some hockey camps in the area, made a few bucks, right? I wanted to do those hockey camps because I just wanted to stay connected to the game. And the people that ran the camp were local people. They were credible. They paid me whatever they paid me per hour. I wasn't looking to make a living out of it. I was looking to, give back and give back to youth, who were, like I was 10 years earlier. I think a lot has changed now, with this commercialization. And that's what concerns me, because to tie it back to higher ed, I'd love to have the data on how much families are spending as a proportion of their disposable income on, this pathway, if you will, to, thinking that there's a professional or a college scholarship, for athletics. And if you were to take that commensurate money and put it into a 529 and save it over time, and actually do well in academics, the return on investment for most people is likely going to be much greater if the goal is a college education. And I don't think we have good data that we're sharing with people on that.
And I also would question the true motivations of many parents, because most financial advisors would be saying, don't put your money in that club sport, put your money in the investment account and you will be better off. But most parents look at that and go, but what about my kids' sporting experiences? What about my experiences supporting them in college? And so I think it will always be there in some way. One of the things I found very interesting is I have a teenager who is talented in one sport. In part, I'll take credit because I coach him, but he's expressed interest in trying other sports. Guess what? Unless you play club sports and already have talent, you can't play that sport, right, especially the team sport. And so he's expressed, so I'd love to try to learn to play volleyball. I don't know where you would learn to play volleyball, because unless you started when you were 9 and 10 in the rec leagues in the local city parks and rec, it's not available because now you're traveling to here, there, and everywhere to compete for your club, and you're obviously not good enough because you've never played before. And
Yeah.
I think we've almost trapped youth into having to make a decision about what they play before they hit teenage years. And guess what? Teenage years is when most kids quit.
Yeah.
So I worry that we've forgotten almost the sandlot sports where kids can just go out and play different sports and learn different sports and experience what they enjoy doing. And we've pushed them into a specific sport. Maybe they burn out, maybe they quit, maybe they don't quote unquote make it. And then they have no sports for the rest of their lives because they've never experienced the sport they may have enjoyed for a lifetime.
Yeah. Similar concerns. I think, I think a lot about research design and how we sort of try to study things. And, the counterfactual that, to the example you just gave is it would be really interesting to know if we gave those sandlot opportunities to, sort of a random sample of people in a community, how many of those would, if truly had those opportunities over a number of years, would have beat out the others who went the club route and paid all the money, the head to head, right? And you do hear these stories from time to time. You hear the pro athlete or the college athlete who didn't pick up their sport until their sophomore year, right? And they're just a phenomenal athlete, and they could have been good at a lot of different things. And all of a sudden, they never played basketball, and now they're a college basketball player, or hockey, or whatever the case may be. We'll never know. But I agree. I mean, the other thing I try to emphasize, and when I would talk to our incoming college student athletes, kind of like at an orientation, and their parents actually as well, I would try to emphasize, two things. And this would be we used to have a meeting where there would be, the parents and the student athletes together, and I would address them. And I would say, I've got a message, I've got a couple of different messages, a couple of different points that I want to sort of emphasize. One point was for the student athletes, I want you to remember when you started playing the sport. And I want you to remember at a very young age, what was one of your most fun experiences with the sport. Not successful experiences necessarily, but fun, right? So it might have been, at age 8, when your team won, or maybe your team didn't win, but you went out for ice cream afterwards or whatever. It was a fun experience. And the point I was trying to make is you started playing the sport and you continued presumably playing your sport because it was fun. Don't lose the fun now that you are getting into a highly competitive, highly regimented, and you've been at that level in club and high school to get here. But don't forget the fun factor, because when you lose the fun factor, then what's the purpose, right? I think you're a better athlete if you can have fun in what you do. What I say to the parents is, and this is the same thing you would say to a parent of a non-student athlete coming to college. It's now time to let these students, sort of live on their own, right? Don't be the helicopter parent. Give them some space. Don't be asking them every evening, how was practice? Do you think you're going to play on Saturday? Why aren't you getting playing time? Because that creates more pressure for them, right? They're here now, and they were the best, or one of the best where they came from. They're now one of many people who were the best. And who knows how it's all going to play out. But, if you keep asking them questions, it's just going to put more stress, on them. And they need to kind of continue to develop. So I think we do lose sight of that. And, what's most concerning to me and frustrating to me is when I hear the stories of the parents, going back to money. It's kind of like Johnny and Mary. There's an expectation of a return on investment, where that return is some calculation in terms of success in the sport, getting the college scholarship, getting recruited by a college team, scoring the goal, whatever the case may be. And I just hate seeing those experiences where parents who invest that money then tell their kid that they're a failure because the return that they generate in terms of their performance doesn't pan out relative to their expectations. And unfortunately, we do see a lot of that, right? We do see a lot of, I don't know why you don't work harder, or you can't score more goals. We've put so much into this. Well, putting resources into something is no guarantee for athletic success, right? And I think it's a shame in cases where sometimes there is that kind of almost commercial or transactional component to it.
I think there's a lesson there as well for coaches to remember to have fun, because it's one thing telling the parent or having the parent tell the kid to have fun, but if the coach doesn't make the environment fun, we're going to have problems. And so it's important, I think, especially in an age of NIL and transfer portal, where a player can up and leave at a moment's notice whenever they want. You want to create an environment where they want to stay there, where they want to be there, where they may put aside potentially lucrative opportunities elsewhere to say, no, this is a great place for me. This is where I want to develop and belong. So
Yeah.
challenge for coaches too.
Yeah, just related to that, I would say, as I self-reflect, and that's why I think, folks like you who think about this coaching at all levels and sort of training and resources to develop coaches, makes a lot of sense. It's something I've thought more of since you and I met, but hadn't thought as much of. But I think back when I was a young parent, and my kids were just getting involved in youth sports. And I had volunteered to be a coach, right? I had come from playing 4 years of college hockey at a pretty competitive level. And, we had practice plans, right? We knew what we were going to do when we got on that ice for, and 75 to 90 minutes a day. And so I saw it, and it made a lot of sense, right? Okay, we're going to do these drills, and we're going to be efficient with our time, and we're going to prepare for our opponents. So when I go out to coach, soccer at age 6, or baseball for little league, right? I'm thinking, well, yeah, I got to develop a practice plan, and we got to regiment this. So I had my piece of paper, and I would, okay, for the first 10 minutes we're going to stretch, and then we're going to do this, and I wanted to stick to it. And my goal was not I wanted to win at all cost, but it was more I wanted to teach the game, because that's like I felt like that's what I could do best. Like I didn't want them to have fun, but I wanted to learn. And I kind of felt like these 6 or 7-year-olds, if they signed up, and they and their parents, they were here to learn from me about baseball or soccer, and that was my job. I probably, in retrospect, should have made it more fun, but that wasn't as much part of my mindset, because my mindset was formed by my own college level competition. And so again, I wasn't yelling, and I wasn't screaming, and I wasn't upset if we lost, but I was focused on, well, how can I make these guys better by teaching them the game? And if I reflect back 20 years later now, I probably should have lightened up a little bit, and, not pretended that the 1 year that I was a little league coach, I was going to teach the kids everything they needed to know about baseball. Might have been, might have been more important to have a little more fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I've learned a lot myself. If somebody is watching or listening in future and has a question, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Yeah, I would say email would be great. DP Scanlon at psu.edu. That's the same, DXS62 at psu.edu. Yeah, I'd be happy to connect with anyone. I think, probably anyone listening to this, and both of us, we're here because we see the value, we've experienced the value that sport can bring. I want to see anybody that's interested in that, having that. I want to see it for my kids, my future grandkids, for others, right? And so I think we're all connected in that way. We can go off the rails a little bit if we don't think about these things from time to time. So I'm happy to chat with anybody that wants to reach out.
Well, thank you, Dennis. And just a reminder, everybody, we try to do these once every few weeks, and we'll have another guest, but be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening from. Also, just a reminder, if you're in the Tallahassee area in October 10th, we'll be having one of our clinics, our coaching clinics here at Tallahassee. So excited to host here at FSU October 10th. But on behalf of myself, Tim Baghurst, and Dennis Scanlon, thanks so much for watching.
Thanks, Tim.